Mention the Triumph TR7 in a room full of British car enthusiasts and watch what happens. A few will shake their heads, someone will mention the strikes, someone else will bring up the wedge, and the word will carry a weight that has nothing to do with geometry. And somewhere at the back there will be a person, probably someone who actually owned one, who will tell you it was better than people say, that it drove well, that it was unfairly buried by a combination of terrible timing, industrial chaos, and a press that had already made its mind up before the first road test was filed. They are all, in their own way, correct. The TR7 is the most argued about British sports car of its generation because it contains more contradictions per square inch than almost anything else built at Coventry or anywhere else in the 1970s. It was the product of a company in managed decline, designed by a man whose previous work had been widely mocked, built in a factory that was at war with itself, and launched into a market that was changing faster than anyone at British Leyland had correctly anticipated. And yet, over 112,000 were built. It raced, it won, it survived everything that was thrown at it for 6 years of production, and today it occupies a place in the classic car market that its original press notices would have made seem impossible. There are 13 things about the TR7's story that most people do not know or do not know fully, and some of them will genuinely surprise you. One of them, and we will get to it, involves a decision made before the car was even finished that shaped everything that followed, and that was based on something that never actually happened. Fact 1. It was designed by the man behind the Allegro. The TR7's styling came from Harris Mann, a designer at British Leyland who had been responsible for the Austin Allegro, a car whose reception from the British public had not, by any generous interpretation, been enthusiastic. The Allegro's round steering wheel and its proportions had made it a fixture in a particular kind of British comedy, and Mann carried that reputation into every subsequent project, whether the subsequent work deserved it or not. The TR7's wedge shape, the sharply rising belt line, the low nose, the visual suggestion of forward motion even when stationary, was not, in the context of 1975, unusual. It was the design language that Giugiaro had established with the Lotus Esprit concept and that several manufacturers were exploring simultaneously. Mann's execution of it for the TR7 was confident and committed. Whether you find the result attractive is genuinely a matter of personal opinion. What it was not was derivative or timid. Whatever else the TR7 looked like, it did not look like an apology. Fact 2, it was built for a ban that never came. Here is the decision I mentioned at the opening, the one that shaped everything. The TR7 was designed as a fixed-head coupe with no convertible variant in the original plan because British Leyland's product planners were convinced that the United States government was about to introduce legislation banning open-top cars on safety grounds. The American market was the TR7's primary target, and if open cars were going to be prohibited, there was no commercial logic in engineering one. The ban never materialized. The legislation that had been anticipated was debated, delayed, revised, and eventually abandoned. The convertible TR7, the body style that the car's proportions arguably suited better than the coupe, did not reach the market until 1979, 4 years after launch, by which point the moment had been substantially missed. When the Roadster finally arrived, it was well received, and many who drove both variants agreed the open car was the more convincing of the two. The fixed head existed because of a ghost. Fact 3, the Americans got it first. The TR7 went on sale in the United States in January of 1975, a full year before British buyers could purchase one. This was not an unusual strategy for British Leyland. The American market's volume and its premium pricing for British sports cars made it a commercial priority, but it produced the slightly absurd situation in which a car branded as a British sports car was being driven on Californian freeways while the people who had built it in Liverpool could not yet buy one. UK sales began in May of 1976. By that point, the American press had already filed its verdicts, and those verdicts had crossed the Atlantic. The domestic launch was greeted with a critical reception that had been partly preformed by reports from a market that applied different criteria, different roads, and different expectations to a car of this type. Fact 4. The engine was a deliberate step backward. Every TR before the TR7 had been powered by a 6-cylinder engine. The TR6, which the TR7 replaced, used a 2.5-litre straight 6, producing approximately 150 brake horsepower in US specification and considerably more in the European tune. The TR7 replaced all of that with a 1,998 cubic centimetre single overhead camshaft 4-cylinder engine, producing approximately 105 brake horsepower in the form delivered to most markets. The decision was driven by emissions regulations, fuel economy requirements, and the practical realities of what British Leyland could certify and manufacture efficiently. It was commercially and technically defensible. It was also, to buyers who had owned a TR6 and understood what a sports car 6-cylinder sounded like at full throttle, a considerable disappointment. The 4-cylinder TR7 was not slow by the standards of its immediate competitors, and its handling was genuinely better than the TR6's. But the engine note was simply not the same conversation, and some people never forgave it. Fact 5. The Speak factory was at war with itself. The TR7 was initially produced at Triumph's factory at Speak, on the outskirts of Liverpool. Speak had a reputation within British Leyland that was not primarily associated with manufacturing excellence. Between 1975 and 1978, the factory experienced industrial action on a scale that disrupted production so severely that delivery commitments to the American market, the market the car had been primarily designed for, could not be met reliably. Dealers who had ordered cars waited, customers who had deposited money waited longer. The specific number of working days lost to strikes at Speak during the TR7's production there has been documented in various accounts of the period, and the figures are not comfortable reading for anyone who wants to believe that the car's commercial difficulties were primarily the fault of the product rather than the process. Production transferred to the Canley plant in Coventry in 1978 and later to Solihull, but the reputational damage from the Speak years was not easily repaired. Fact 6. British Leyland was collapsing around it. The TR7 was launched in the same period that British Leyland was being nationalised, investigated by the Ryder Report, reorganised under Michael Edwards, and subjected to a level of political and industrial scrutiny that would have been challenging for any manufacturer to operate within. The company that produced the TR7 was simultaneously managing the Allegro, the Princess, the Maxi, the Rover SD1, the Mini, and a production infrastructure spread across dozens of sites that had never been rationalized into a coherent whole. The TR7 was not a priority in any meaningful budgetary sense. The development funds that might have addressed its known weaknesses earlier, the 5-speed gearbox that did not arrive until 1976, the convertible that arrived 4 years late, the engine that needed the V8 it never officially received in sufficient numbers, were competed for by a dozen other programs in an organization that was fighting for its institutional survival. The car was a good product managed by a company that had no capacity left for managing anything well. Fact 7. The 5-speed gearbox was an afterthought. The TR7 launched with a 4-speed manual gearbox. The 5-speed unit, which transformed the car's motorway cruising character and addressed one of the most consistent criticisms in early road tests, did not become available until 1976, after production was already underway. An automatic transmission option was also offered, which suited the American market's preferences, but which attracted in Britain the kind of response that automatic gearboxes in sports cars reliably attracted in Britain in the 1970s. The 5-speed car is, by common consent among TR7 owners today, meaningfully better than the 4-speed in the specific conditions that expose the difference. At motorway speeds, the 5-speed allows the engine to operate well below its stress point, reducing noise and improving fuel consumption in a way that matters considerably on a long journey. It is one of the cleaner examples in British automotive history of a car that was improved by listening to its owners rather than its original specification. Fact 8. There was a V8 and it was magnificent. The TR8 was everything the TR7 should perhaps have been from the beginning. It took the TR7's body, which was, by the late 1970s, a proven and well-understood structure, and placed the Rover 5.8 engine beneath the bonnet. The 3,528 cubic centimeters all-aluminium V8, producing in TR8, specification approximately 133 brake horsepower in US emissions-restricted form and considerably more in development and competition tune, transformed the car's character entirely. 0 to 60 times for the TR8 in road trim were recorded by contemporary tests at around 8 seconds, with a top speed in the region of 130 miles per hour. The engine note was everything the 4 cylinders had not been. Approximately 2,700 TR8s were built, the overwhelming majority destined for the American market, and production ended with the model's discontinuation in 1981. A genuine TR8 in documented condition is today among the more sought-after British sports cars of its era, and the gap in value between a TR7 and a comparable TR8 reflects exactly how much the engine changed the equation. Fact 9. It went rallying and Tony Pond drove it. British Leyland entered the TR7 in international rally competition through their Works programme, and the car contested events at the highest level of the sport, including the RAC Rally of Great Britain. Tony Pond, the same driver who would later figure in Vauxhall's rally history, drove Works TR7 and TR8 competition cars in events that demonstrated the platform's structural integrity under conditions that revealed whatever weaknesses existed in a competition car with uncomfortable efficiency. The Rally TR7 and TR8 were developed significantly beyond their road car specifications, and the program produced results that were respectable given the resources available and the turbulence of the organization behind the cars. The competition history of the TR7 is not as celebrated as that of the Escort or the Mini Cooper, partly because the program operated during a period when British Leyland's public image made almost any news it generated difficult to receive straightforwardly. The cars were better than the coverage suggested. Fact 10. The convertible was better than the coupe. When the TR7 Roadster finally reached the market in 1979, the reception it received from road testers who had been broadly unenthusiastic about the fixed head was notably warmer. The open car revealed something about the TR7's proportions that the coupe had obscured. The wedge shape, which in closed form produced a roofline that divided opinion sharply, worked considerably better without a roof. The car looked lower, more purposeful, and more honestly a sports car. The Roadster also confirmed what the chassis engineers had built. With the roof removed and the sills stiffened to compensate for the loss of the structural contribution the roof had provided, the car's handling characteristics were essentially unchanged from the coupe, a tribute to how well the basic structure had been designed, since many convertible conversions of the period degraded the driving experience meaningfully through scuttle shake and reduced rigidity. The TR7 Roadster did not. It was simply the car that should have been available in 1975. Fact 11. The press had made up its mind. Early, the TR7's critical reception in Britain was shaped in part by the context in which the car arrived. 1976 was not a good year to launch a British Leyland product in the British motoring press. The company's difficulties The strikes, the nationalization, the quality control issues that had followed other models created a frame through which any new BL car was examined with a skepticism that a less troubled manufacturer's product would not have faced in the same way. Several period road tests acknowledged qualities in the TR7 that the overall verdict then failed to reflect. The ride quality, which was genuinely good, the handling balance, which was better than the TR6's and better than most contemporaries at the price, the interior, which was by British Leyland's recent standards, well finished. The narrative had formed before the tests were driven. This is not unique to the TR7 in automotive journalism's history, but in the TR7's case, the gap between what the cars delivered and what the coverage said they delivered was wide enough to have had a measurable commercial effect. Fact 12. Over 112,000 were built despite everything. The strikes, the late convertible, the four-cylinder disappointment, the hostile press, the collapsing parent company, the TR7 sold. Total production across the full run from 1975 to 1981 reached approximately 112,368 examples, a figure drawn from the production records of the TR register and consistent across the principal sources. That is a meaningful number for a British sports car of the period, and it places the TR7 well ahead of many contemporaries whose reputations have aged considerably better. The American market absorbed the majority of this production. British buyers took a smaller share, and the European market a smaller share still. The distribution reflects the car's design priorities honestly. It was conceived for California, and it found its largest audience there. The fact that a car designed primarily for an export market sold in the volumes it did, despite the manufacturing difficulties that attended its entire production life, is the commercial argument that the TR7's detractors rarely address directly. Fact 13. It is now genuinely collectible. The classic car market's reassessment of the TR7 has been gathering pace since roughly the early 2010s, and the trajectory is consistent with what happens to maligned cars from significant manufacturers when the generation that dismissed them is replaced by a generation that evaluates them on their own terms. A well-preserved TR7 Roadster in original color with a documented service history is now a car that attracts serious attention at specialist events and that commands prices reflecting genuine collector interest rather than entry-level nostalgia. The TR8 commands a premium that reflects both its rarity and its performance, and competition-prepared TR7s and TR8s with documented rally history have achieved results at specialist auction that would have been unimaginable in the 1980s. The TR Register, one of Britain's longest-established single-mark clubs, maintains a community of owners and restorers whose technical knowledge of the car is comprehensive, and the parts supply situation, while not without its challenges, is better supported than for many contemporaries of equal age and lower production volume. The TR7 has survived its own reputation. That is no small thing. 13 facts, and the thread that runs through all of them is the same one that runs through the history of almost every British car built between 1970 and 1982. The distance between what the engineers achieved and what the institution surrounding them was capable of delivering. The TR7 was not a bad car. It was a decent car, in some respects a genuinely good one, that was built in the wrong factory, launched at the wrong moment, half-planned, around a regulation that never came, and handed to a press that had already decided what it thought before it drove one. The convertible that should have been ready in 1975 arrived in 1979. The V8 that would have made it the car it was always meant to be reached barely 2,700 buyers, nearly all of them in America, before the whole program was shut down. The rally cars were competitive and largely ignored. The production numbers that should have vindicated The car were achieved in spite of conditions that would have finished a less robust product entirely. What the TR7 deserved, and largely did not receive, was a fair hearing on its own terms. It is getting one now, slowly, in the columns of specialist publications and at the shows where the owners bring them out, and people who have not seen one in 30 years stop and look again. The most controversial sports car Britain ever built has turned out, on closer examination, to be more interesting than its reputation suggested. Cars that survive their own reviews generally are. Now I want to hear from you. Did you own a TR7 or a TR8? Did you defend it at the time, or did you share the consensus that the press had built, and has anything changed in your assessment since? If you drove one on a good road in the right conditions, tell me what that was actually like. Because that is the account that is missing from most of the published record, and it is the one I would most like to read. Leave it in the comments. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscription are appreciated. Thank you for watching.